Every so often, a robbery takes place that involves such enormous sums of money that it becomes a source of fascination for the press and public alike. The Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard dates back to 1874 and houses artifacts and evidence collected over 2 centuries of crime. Many of the exhibits have made history, furthering developments in forensic science or cornering some of Britain's most notorious criminals. These items have rarely been touched, many have never been seen since they made their journey from courtroom to crime museum. There's early fingerprint evidence, blood typing, DNA advancements, and an arsenal of guns, knives, and poisons. Some crimes are remembered for the sheer audacity of the criminals involved. This film reopens one that made headlines around the globe, and where fingerprints from this beer can led to a gang of thieves who stole more than ever before in peacetime history. London in the early 60s. And in the days before credit cards, direct debits, or internet banking, cash is king, and every villain wanted it. A jewel thief, Bruce Reynolds, wanted lots of it and had an idea of how to get his hands on it. It was amazingly simple, almost cheeky, but he'd have to be ruthless if need be, and he'd need a small army to carry it through. One by one, he handpicked 15 other men, each chosen for his individual skill or muscle, mostly as crooked as he was, and all to carry out the biggest heist Britain had ever seen.
You sort of had a mixture of jobs that these guys were in. I mean, the vast majority, you'd see, if they had a business card, they should put crook or thieves on it. They didn't like villains. That was a different class of criminal, if you like, element in Britain at the time, which was the enforcers, the gangs and things, whether it's the Crays, Richardsons and things. So some of them had very normal jobs.
The lineup included Ronnie Biggs, a carpenter and builder. Together, the 16-strong squad became convinced they had a foolproof plan that would give them wealth beyond imagination.
So every night you used to have the mail train that would go from Glasgow to London carrying all the mail coming from Scotland down to the south. But it also had high-value packages, plus on certain days, big quantities of cash coming down to be burnt.
The Royal Mail train usually carried a lot of high-value items, often around £300,000, and security was minimal. Bruce Reynolds' plan was bold. He'd do something to stop the train mid-journey at dead of night and in the middle of nowhere. But where and when and how? They spent 5 long months checking the route, perfecting their scheme, and choosing a date.
They originally thought they were going on the 7th of August, but this Ulsterman, who'd given them the information, was so good he told them, you don't hit the train until I tell you which one. And it was because they were waiting after a bank holiday in Scotland when there would be far more money on a certain day coming down. So they had to sit an extra 24 hours biding their time. You can imagine how nervous everybody got because they'd hyped themselves up.
The team assembled at a hideout called Leatherslade Farm in Buckinghamshire, about 30 miles from where the heist was going to take place. Bruce Reynolds heard from an insider that the Glasgow to London Royal Mail train would reach their ambush at 3:40 in the morning. All they had to do was wait.
So 24 hours go past. On the night of the 7th, around midnight going into the 8th of August, they got in the 2 Land Rovers and the van, and they drove slowly at sensible speed across the 27 miles to the site of the robbery.
They had their hideout, they'd planned their route, they had an absurdly simple way to stop the train. It would be like a military assault. They equipped themselves with all-terrain escape vehicles, walkie-talkie radios, and phone wire cutters.
Bruce and some of the others took one of the Land Rovers, and they'd already, having cased the area, worked out what phone lines needed to be cut, not only on the train side, but also there were 2 or 3 farms round that area who they felt would be the only people that might be out being farmers, might spot something and call in, so they cut all their lines off.
The trap was set. The train approached. One of the gang had placed a hood over the lamp behind the green signal and used a battery to light the red one. The train stopped just as planned. The co-driver went to call the signal box to find out what was wrong, but the phone lines had been cut. When he came back to the cab, he was thrown down the embankment.
Bizarrely, there was hardly any well, there was no security on the train. They just assumed that it would never get stopped. They then uncoupled the 2 front carriages and the locomotive from the back carriages. And then the idea was they were already swarming around it, so the only people that were aware that anything was happening was the train driver and his fireman, the 2 guys who were driving the train. And then the thing was to move the train forward up to Bridego Bridge so they could unload all the money on board.
With all the mail bags they could physically carry, they warned the terrified train staff not to move for 30 minutes. But far from being the perfect crime, the whole plan depended on intimidation. And the public would be appalled that the train driver was pistol-whipped and injured. His family said he never recovered. But what was perfect, the gang left not a trace of useful evidence behind.
They were meticulous in the planning up until everything that needed to be done on the robbery.
The exhilarated gang drove through the darkness back to Leatherslade Farm, and only then, when they looked at their haul, did they understand the full enormity of their crime. There was more money than they could believe.
I don't think they had any idea they were going to get the sheer quantity of money they had. Most of the gang involved were thieves. They were people that stole things.
There was so much cash, they had to count it in shifts.
At the time, it was the biggest robbery. The Great Train Robbery was the biggest robbery that had ever taken place in Britain. And if you actually start converting the values to today's values, it's still right up there. It was £2.6 million, and at today's rates, you can call that anything to 30, 40 million pounds. Invested the money would be 80 million pounds. So it was absolutely enormous.
The mob had hit the jackpot. They couldn't contain their excitement and celebrated wildly.
The story of them playing Monopoly with real money is true. And the funny thing is that by delaying the robbery by a day, it actually took place on Ronnie Biggs's birthday. So they also all gave him a £5 as his birthday present. But they were all playing, and there's meant to be that I think it was Charlie Wilson in playing the game that he actually offered £5,000 to buy a get-out-of-jail card just for a bit of fun.
The gang had brought provisions to last 2 weeks and were prepared to wait that long till all the fuss died down.
But then there was the realisation that, A, the police were already on the case and were swarming all over the countryside looking for the hideout, because they knew there was a hideout somewhere. They just felt there was.
It was Ronnie Biggs's job to keep an ear on the radio in case of police developments.
Hearing the news on the radio, and it kept coming in that they were convinced that they were still in the area, that they realised they couldn't stick to their plan of holding out for 2 weeks. And, you know, looking back now, they might say that they would have done okay.
Having heard from the train crew that they'd been told not to move for 30 minutes, the police let it be known they were looking for a hideout within a radius of 30 miles.
They'd become convinced that the police were going to look at every farm property and every property within a 30-mile radius of the robbery site. They felt they had to get out of there, and that's why they abandoned the farm.
In fact, panic set in, and one by one the gang fled with their share of the cash. Bruce Reynolds had arranged for a team of local criminals to wipe the farm clean of forensic evidence.
Something went wrong. It never was. The cleaners never got there.
Like all the best-laid plans, they seem brilliant until they unravel. The gang had been thorough thinking through the robbery. Now, fearing police were scouring the area, they bungled their escape. After the robbery, the gang fled to what they thought was a safe house, Leatherslade Farm. This is just impressionistic, of course, but this is the real thing. This Pipkin beer tin would eventually lead to the downfall and capture of Britain's most wanted robbers. This is the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard. It's home to the world's largest collection of crime scene artefacts. In fact, only a select few have ever viewed these intriguing and sometimes rather grisly objects. But now, with exclusive access, we can show you some of the secrets within. August 1963, and a Royal Mail train with £2.5 million in cash on board was raided. The gang escaped to their farm hideout but grew paranoid as they heard on the radio the police were combing the surrounding area. They'd split their loot and were desperate to make their getaway. One by one, the Great Train robbers fled Leatherslade Farm. And despite their best-laid plans, they left it full of clues. After the most spectacular robbery in British history, the police were on their trail. What did the place look like? What did Leatherslade Farm look like when the police first went in?
Not as messy as this, probably, but it was a farm, basically an empty farm. But you had 16 guys who'd been staying there for several days, so it was fairly lived in. There was sort of mailbags, there was the wrappers off the money. And these were, some of the mailbags were being dug into holes outside in the back garden.
But it was blindingly obvious this had been the gang's hideout from the moment you walked in the front door.
Yes, no doubts that that had been the place.
And blindingly obvious it had gone off in a hurry.
Yes, yeah, I think that's fair to say, yeah. Because they'd even left, I mean, even the lorry was still parked there, that they'd done the robbery. But as soon as the police got to it, which was on the 13th of August, they made the statement, you know, it's just full of clues, which was all the fingerprints. Though none of the cash was left behind, it was obvious the gang and their loot had been there. The police described the farm as an evidence goldmine. This is a piece of evidence that really did for the gang. Tell us about it. Yeah, that is one of the pieces they found at Leatherslade Farm where the gang was held up. It was a pipkin of ale that a man called Bobby Welsh happened to stop on the way to the farm to buy some supplies for the gang. And he was the man who bought this, and it's his fingerprints they found on the can. And the exhibits officers written on here found cupboard under sink unit next to back door and kitchen part full. So they really did rush off, leaving they did
beer
indeed.
behind apart from anything else, leaving all sorts of clues. The robbers had never expected such a huge haul of cash, but instead of it instilling discipline, they began to get arrogant and sloppy. In theory, the entire group of all 16 were meant to wear gloves the whole time because they knew of the dangers of fingerprints and things. But people got careless when playing Monopoly and things. They took it off. It was easier with the small pieces, take gloves off. The role of Bruce Reynolds, the gang's leader, was now over. It was now every man for himself. You know, that's as far as we take you. Here's your money. Now, each person, so you had 16 individuals, each with different ideas of what to do. Bruce Reynolds had arranged for the hideout to be cleaned, but there's no honour among thieves, and the farm was left smothered in clues. The robbers' prints were found on the bath, on tins and bottles, and on the Monopoly board. Once the police knew who certain people were or had ideas, they would then go and visit the people they knew who worked with them. So they all made themselves scarce, and that virtually again told the police we're on the right track. And then arrests, really, once they'd found the farm and they started working out who was involved, the arrests pretty much came fairly quickly after that as they started picking them off one by one. Led by Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper of the Flying Squad, the police quickly identified several suspects, based on the evidence found at the farm and from tip-offs among the criminal fraternity. As far as the police working out who might have been involved, they think there were certain elements in, you know, the underworld criminal society who were actually a bit jealous that they hadn't been involved in the robbery and might have mentioned names to the police. The first gang members to be caught were William Bowl and Roger Caudry, who were lying low in a rented flat. In a hidden cavity there, police found their stash of cash. Though Bruce Reynolds and 3 others got away, arrest after arrest followed. The key in the court case was proving that the gang, the member or the people that were being accused of the Great Train Robbery, that they had been at the farm, because there was no evidence left at the actual train and the robbery site. There were no fingerprints, no real evidence to put anybody at the site of the robbery. So the jury had to believe that if the court proved, the prosecution proved, if you were at the farm, at Leatherslade Farm, you took part in the train robbery. And the way they were doing that was fingerprints at the farm that showed you could definitely be placed in the farm at that time. You were a member of the train robbery gang. The fingerprint evidence was compelling. All those shown to be present at Leatherslade Farm were found guilty of the Great Train Robbery. The average sentence was 30 years apiece.
Most of them ended up spending 15, 20 years in the end. I mean, parole did come in. The interesting thing was nobody understood why they were given 30 years at the time, because it was more than spies were getting, more than murderers were getting. The interesting thing was when Buster Edwards was eventually caught several years later, the judge in his case only gave him 15 years, which does seem a bit strange because it was the same crime and people knew that Buster had quite a high part to play in it. And even when Bruce was finally caught, he originally got 24 years. So it was sort of the difference in sentencing was quite a lot.
But the story didn't end there. Ronnie Biggs was prepared to pay a fortune to be sprung from jail and spent nearly 4 decades on the run.
Ron originally was going to sit it out and see what happened, but the way he was being treated and moved around every day, they'd move his cell and stuff, that eventually people in the prison said, "I'm sorry, Ron, we're going to get you out." And that's how he disappeared.
With help from the mob on the outside, Biggs went over the wall at Wandsworth Prison and escaped to Paris with his wife. After plastic surgery to conceal his identity, Biggs settled with his family in Australia, where he worked as a builder and lived a relatively normal life. But 5 years after the Great Train Robbery, Bruce Reynolds was finally arrested, and once again, Biggs's picture was published round the world. Someone spotted him, and he had to run again, this time from Australia to Brazil. There, a stroke of luck. Biggs fathered a Brazilian child, which meant he was immune to extradition. As a result, he lived openly in Rio de Janeiro. Meanwhile, the search went on for all that missing money. 2.5 million quid stolen.
Yep.
That's, in today's money, 30, 40 million pounds, 50, 60, 70, 80 million dollars. And we're talking huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
Where did it go?
Well, most of the gang had worked out who they wanted to leave it with, because they couldn't have that at home, because it was just sheer quantities of it. Now, you have to expect the guys that got arrested very quickly, that money just sat around for their wives and things, probably devalued over the years. The other players in it, the people like Bruce, Buster Edwards, Ronnie Biggs, when they were escaped, they were using that money up to keep themselves in freedom, because it cost a lot of money. Even, to give you an idea, probably it'd be £5,000 in those days to get someone to mind your money for a while, and only part of it. So that's where a lot of the money, but very little of the money has ever been recovered from the entire robbery. And partly that was due to there were no serial numbers taken. It was all just money to be destroyed. So there was no list of the actual notes used in the Great Train Robbery. I assume they're all out of circulation now.
While most of the robbers spent much of their lives in jail, and Ronnie Biggs stayed free, 2 other members of the gang have never been identified or caught. So there were only 2 or 3 of the gang of 16 who actually enjoyed spending their money.
Yep. For those 3 guys, so the perfect crime. You know, they committed the crime, yes, but they got away with their entire share. But the pressure of them always feeling the hand on their shoulder must have been there, that they had to keep, they couldn't go out and buy Ferraris or anything. It would just bring the attention to them too much. I mean, probably who did the best for his money was Ron, that he got to enjoy it more than most. But no, for most of them, they really didn't get to join the spoils of the evening's events.
And even Ron finished up after a few years, well, pretty much penniless.
Oh, yes. I mean, the money for to get across to France, to use for the plastic surgeon, to have people look after him, false passports, everything like that. So by the time he'd had his Australian adventure, virtually all the money had gone. So he had very little money when he arrived in Brazil.
So the Great Train Robbery turned out to be a bit of a disaster for almost everyone involved. And yet its sheer audacity, the vastness of the money, has taken it beyond the realm of facts and into legend.
Well, I mean, one time I was talking with Bruce about it, and I was looking at maps of the area and giving my theories of why didn't they do this, including barge boats up to Birmingham and the stuff. And he just simply turned around and he said, Chris, with due respect, he said, you went to a good school and had a good education. So they're sort of self-depreciating that they thought it through, and if they'd thought the rest through, they would have probably got away. I mean, I think today we look how close Aylesbury is to London with the M4 and everything and those bits, and you just think, why didn't they make the run for London and just get back to their own hideouts and safe houses rather than this whole thing of going to the farm, which was ultimately their downfall.
So all the sophistication that had gone into the planning, it all ended in a chaos, really.
Yeah. If somebody burnt the farm down and they got rid of that piece of evidence, then none of the guys would have been found guilty, or they'd have had to have found different ways of tying them with the Great Train Robbery, because the key was the farm.
Despite it taking place almost half a century ago, its fascination has been enduring. And some of the characters involved have become household names.
It happened overnight, so it didn't hit the papers the next morning. So the first people who would have got it would have been the radio, and then the TV, and then the evening papers in London. And then, of course, you get on to the... So it would now be the 9th was when it really broke in the papers, and the speculation of how much money was involved. And it was just front-page news. And it became this Robin Hood story, or... It was, for some reason, the public took it, that they thought it was quite amusing that this gang of guys had stopped a train that belonged to the government, in theory. They took money belonging to the government. It didn't belong to an institution or anybody. It was government's money, and seemed to do it all in a sort of lovable rogue's way. And the fascination's never left people. It's just one of those crimes that, you know, is just one of the great crimes. And people still to this day have a certain sympathy, because the government of the day was so unpopular, a certain sympathy with the players in it. And it also made the police who were involved, people like Jack Slipper and Tommy Butler, they became equally famous for the case.
Now, nearly all the gang are dead, and those that survive are ones who never got to spend the proceeds of this, the most famous of crimes. It's something of a cliche that crime rarely pays, but in spectacular crimes it's usually true. The Great Train Robbers were just ordinary thugs, and they came out of prison as broke as the day they went in. Only Ronnie Biggs got away for a time, but eventually his luck ran out too. In 2001, after nearly 40 years on the run, Ronnie Biggs finally gave up and voluntarily returned to Britain. He was rearrested and re-imprisoned, with 28 years still left to serve. For 130 years, the Crime Museum of New Scotland Yard has been archiving the tools, the relics and the instruments of the most notorious killers, the most infamous conmen, the most audacious of thieves. Nowadays, it's a training ground for police and judiciary, but it's also a sombre reminder of humanity's capacity for evil, and a tribute to the triumphs of Scotland Yard.
Coming up, murder in top London store Harvey Nichols, and 999 operators hear a woman pleading in vain for her life as she is attacked by a man with a knife. The stalking that turns to murder after the break.